What's up guys, Sagi here from Tech Gear Talk. Today we're going to be taking a look at possibly the best all-in-one photography and videography camera from Sony, the RX10 Mark IV. Now this is a pretty unique camera and Sony was able to combine kind of a crazy amount of features into one camera. The Mark IV is the next iteration of the really popular Mark III. And it's a good camera for casual sports, for action and wildlife photographers, and also a great camera to take with you when you travel or go on family vacations. I also think that if you're interested in video and looking for a high quality all-in-one option, that this might be a good camera for you. And my goal with every product review is to give you a good overview of the features of the product, but in a way that relates to how you use it in real life. And if you find that this review was helpful, please let me know by giving it a like and then hitting the subscribe and notification buttons for more camera and tech reviews. This is going to be a pretty in-depth review of the RX10 Mark IV. And every camera has its pros and its cons. If you're serious about your research, I suggest that you watch this video to the end. As I mentioned, this camera has a pretty unique set of features, so let's take a look at some highlights before we dive into the detailed review. The RX10 Mark IV is what we call a bridge camera, and it has a 20.1 megapixel 1-inch CMOS sensor that comes with 315 phase detection autofocus points. And it also uses the new Bionz X image processor, which improves the speed and performance, and then also the image quality. For photography, it's capable of continuous shooting at 24 frames per second, and that's up to 249 consecutive images. And now we're talking with autofocus and auto exposure. Now for video, you can shoot up to 4K at up to 30 frames per second, and then full HD or 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. Sony paired this camera with a 25 times zoom Zeiss lens with a 35mm equivalent focal range of 24 to 600, which is just insane. And then on top of that, they added image stabilization. There's also a super cool high frame rate feature, which lets you do slow motion at up to 960 frames per second at full HD or 1080p. And then another nice feature for video users is that Sony included a 3.5mm mic input. And that way you can connect an external microphone and get better audio. Finally, like many of the new cameras, it's got Wi-Fi with NFC so that you can super easily move images to your mobile device and then even control the camera using an app. Alright, so let's jump into these features in a little more detail. I want to start out by talking about the camera type. And the RX10 Mark IV is what we call a bridge camera. Now that's a general name that we give digital cameras that have a level of control that's similar to that of DSLRs. They come with long-range zoom lenses and a viewfinder, but usually they don't allow for interchangeable lenses. So essentially they're somewhere between a point and click and a full DSLR. One thing I wanted to mention about actually using this camera is that the aperture is changed using a ring here. It's kind of old school. I'm not really sure why, because if you're shooting in P or shutter priority exposure modes, the camera can make that change digitally, but if in all the other modes, you have to actually change it yourself using this dial, and you can't use the buttons on the back. But ultimately, as far as the body is concerned, it's super easy to handle and very comfortable to shoot with. Now let's talk about the sensor and the processor. The RX10 Mark IV comes with a 20.1 megapixel 1-inch CMOS sensor that is backlighted and stacked. And that means that the DRAM is built into the chip, which ultimately gives it more processing power. Now, without getting too nerdy, this processor contributes to some of the features that we'll talk about later. So like things like super slow motion, 4K video, and then faster and more precise autofocus. In the past, a lot of the bridge cameras that we saw had super small sensors. And what's nice is that Sony put a 1-inch sensor in this camera, which gives you really good results. Now, in order to make this camera even more powerful, Sony paired it up with the Bionz X image processor and front-end LSI. And together, that's what allows for continuous shooting rate of 24 frames per second. And the new processor does a pretty nice job at reducing noise and increasing readout speeds, which is really great for video. Another thing that Sony added is an extended buffer, which lets you shoot 249 JPEG images continuously. And that's with autofocus and auto exposure for each image. So that's more than 10 seconds of continuous shooting. So if you can't get one good picture out of 249, I don't know if I blame the camera. I want to give you an example of what that looks like, so I'm going to hold down the button and start shooting. That's crazy. That's just crazy. I don't even know how many pictures I just took. On top of that, the new processor also makes the camera super responsive and it's fast to operate. The menu functions are fast and it turns on really fast, so you're pretty much ready to shoot right away. And this is a very versatile camera, both for photography and videography, and you'll see that as we go into the next bunch of features. Alright, so next I want to jump into resolution and frame rates. The RX10 Mark IV can shoot 4K video at 24 and 30 frames per second. And then full HD or 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. And that's pretty sweet for this type of bridge camera. I know I've talked about it before, but choosing a frames per second setting has to do with what you want your final video to look like. So if you want something that looks a little bit softer and more cinematic, then you can shoot at, let's say, 24 frames per second. If you want something else that's more crisp and sharp, then you go with 60 frames per second. I shoot all my videos at 30 frames per second because I like to go somewhere in between. I want to talk about 4K video just a little bit. So essentially 4K shoots 4 times the number of pixels as full HD or 1080p. So for each frame, you have that many more pixels to work with. And I don't want to get into it too much so this video doesn't get too long, but I'll link to another video where I explain why you might want to shoot in 4K. Okay, next I want to talk about slow motion and then even super slow motion, which is something that you don't really see at this price range. As I mentioned before, you can shoot full HD at 120 frames per second. So that gives you some flexibility because if you edit your videos at 30 frames per second like I do, and I slow down 120 to 30, then I'm getting 4 times slow motion. So that's really good. If that's not good enough for you, the RX10 Mark IV has an HFR or high frame rate feature that lets you shoot at up to 960 frames per second at 1080p. And there are 3 options for HFR: 240, 480, and 960 frames per second. And so in theory, if your output file is 24 frames per second, this would be slowing things down by a factor of 40. 40! Now, to be honest, the quality of the 960 frames per second footage is too low for me personally. I wouldn't really use that in my videos. You can see it's super noisy, but 480 frames per second is definitely better, and I might use it if I really need it to be that slow. Now, 240 is really nice and is definitely something that I would use. So that's still 10 times slow motion at 24 frames per second and 8 times slow motion at 30 frames per second. And that's just an awesome feature to have. If you like slow motion, this is awesome. Okay, so let's move on to lenses. And here Sony added a built-in Zeiss 25 times zoom lens. And this is a 24 to 600 millimeter Zeiss Varia sonar lens. And it has the T-Star coating on it. And if you're not familiar with that, T-Star is a multi-layer anti-reflective coating from Zeiss. And what it does is allows more light to pass through the lens, and then it produces color that's more true to what our eyes see. This is a really impressive range that we're working with from a focal length standpoint. So 24 to 600 millimeters. So I'll show you some examples of what that actually means in terms of zoom. 24 is pretty wide, but then 600 is just insane. Like, I don't have any lenses that give me this much telephoto. Now, a lot of times people look at a built-in lens as a limiting factor. And I mean, technically it is because you can't change it out. But the ability to go from 24 all the way to 600, I would say covers and then even exceeds what most people use. And this is why it's a great wildlife camera, because you can capture things that are really far away from you. All right, so that brings us to the next topic, which is autofocus, and I'm gonna talk about it both in terms of photography and video. The RX10 Mark IV uses a 315-point phase detection system, which Sony says can focus in as little as 0.03 seconds. And you can also use the system to track subjects as they move through the frame. What's nice about having all these focus points is that you can easily set an off-center focus point, and then you can frame your shot exactly how you want without having to get focus and then reframe it for each shot. And you can also tap on the screen to set your focus point. Sony included a continuous autofocus mode, which lets you select a subject by clicking on it, and then the camera will follow it, so as you're taking pictures of it, it's always in focus. So check out how this system works. I can click on a subject and then keep shooting it, and the RX10 Mark IV will reacquire focus for each exposure. And for video, it works the same way. So if you're shooting an interview and your subject is off-centered, you can just click on right where they are, and it will keep them in focus. Or you can select a subject right on the screen and then tell the camera to follow it, and then even if it's moving through the frame, it's always gonna go around and track it. Now you can also frame a shot with multiple layers, and then you tap to focus while recording. So the RX10 Mark IV will automatically switch focus points. And it does a really good job at shifting focus, and it's pretty fast and it's really, really smooth. Overall, the autofocus system for video is really good. Yeah, so if you're shooting video, if you're creating content for YouTube, if you're vlogging, anything like that, it's gonna do a really nice job for you. Now, one of the things that I found frustrating both on this camera and the A6500 is that the focus indicator is like a middle to dark gray. So as you're moving the focus point around, it's orange, so it's super easy to see. But then it turns to gray, and sometimes it's really hard to see where your focus point is. I just wish there was a simple setting in the menu where you can go and say, okay, I want my focus indicator to be white or orange or whatever it is, and then I can change it based on what I'm shooting. It's not a big deal, but just something that I noticed. Okay, so let's move on to audio, which is something else that people who are gonna use this for video are really gonna appreciate. Now, Sony added a 3.5mm external mic input. And what that lets you do is, instead of using the built-in microphone, which does a pretty decent job, you can connect an external microphone and then get much better sound. So the microphones are here on top of the camera, and they do a pretty good job if you're close to the camera, and also if you're interested in picking up some ambient noise. But there's really no question, this has nothing to do with this camera, there's really no question that if you want to pick up better audio, you're always going to want to use an external microphone. So you can easily put an external microphone right on top of the camera on the hot shoe, and you're good to go. And you can use it for vlogging or recording interviews or anything else where you want to pick up directional sound instead of using the omnidirectional mics that are built into the camera, and they would just pretty much pick up audio from anywhere. As far as vlogging, this isn't a super light setup because the RX10 Mark IV is bigger than most of your vlogging cameras. So I don't know that you're gonna wanna be walking around while hand holding it for a long period of time, but it's doable for short times. But it's definitely great for traveling, and you can just set it on a small tripod and you're good to go. I wanna give props to Sony for again including audio levels on the screen, so you don't have to go into the menu in order to test your audio levels. Now we'll get into this a little bit more later, but because the screen doesn't flip up or to the side, you can't see the levels when the camera is facing you. So what I do is I end up placing the mic on the camera facing the wrong way, mounted on the tripod. Now I can test the levels. Then I just flip it around and have the microphone pointing at the front. And that works. It's not ideal, but it works. And of course you've got other options. You can use a lavalier microphone if you don't mind being tethered to the camera, or you can use a wireless lav, and then you're not tethered at all. It doesn't matter where the camera is. The microphone stays on you, and you're free to move the camera around and get all different types of shots. Now, another thing the videographers are absolutely gonna love is the fact that Sony included a headphone jack. And that means that you can monitor your audio right as you're recording. And that's something that's gonna save you a lot of time. It makes it super easy to identify problems. So a lot of times when you're recording, if you're not monitoring, there could be something that would be super obvious to you if you could listen to it. But instead you're recording, and then by the time you're actually editing, then you realize there was a problem. Whereas if you could just plug in headphones and listen for 2 seconds, you'd say, hey, that fan is on or the heater's on, let's turn that off. And boom, now you have much better audio. So that's a feature I really like. Okay, next I want to talk about the size, weight, and build quality of the RX10 Mark IV. And I would call it a medium-sized camera. So it's not a full-size camera like maybe a 5D, but it's definitely not as small as something like the A6500. It's right in between. It's got a magnesium alloy body, and it has pretty unique sharp lines, which is something you don't see on many other cameras. And this design is both dust and moisture resistant, which is nice because you can use the RX10 Mark IV in relatively harsh environments. Now the grip is super deep, so I can get my entire hand on the camera. And then Sony covered the right side with rubber, so you always get good friction, and you don't have to worry about this camera slipping out of your hand. And Sony also incorporated a super bright, high-resolution XGA OLED True Finder EVF. And you can use the electronic viewfinder for previewing your image and to see all the settings. and the image quality is outstanding. It's really bright and crisp. This is definitely a high-level EVF. Okay, next we're gonna take a look at the new 3-inch screen. So the image quality is excellent, and it could be tilted down like this for overhead shots, and then it can also be pointed up. So at any time where it's on a slider or any time where you're above the camera looking down, you can go ahead and set up the screen wherever it's comfortable, so it's always easy to see what you're shooting. Another thing that I really like about this screen is that you can always use the sunny weather mode. So that's even in 4K and when you're shooting 120 frames per second. And that's something that you couldn't do on the A6500, and that made it a little bit difficult to look at in some weather conditions. So this screen can always be bright, so that's awesome. I have a couple of little issues with the screen. First, it can't be flipped up or to the side, so it can't be used in selfie mode. So if it's like this, I can't see whether I'm framed correctly or not. Now this might not matter to you depending on what you're using this camera for, but if you're planning on using it to create content where you're in front of the camera, just take that into account because you're not gonna be able to see how you're framed and then whether you're in focus or not. And of course you can use an external monitor to preview the shot, but I'll talk more about that later. And then the second issue I have with the screen is that it's only partially touchscreen. So you can use the screen to set focus, and also when you're previewing images, you can zoom in and out, but that's pretty much it. So you can't use it for any of the functions, you can't change any of the settings using the touchscreen, you can't use the menu. It's pretty much just for focus and for zooming in on when you're previewing shots. I just wish that Sony would have made it a full touchscreen. You know, obviously it has the ability to detect when I touch it. It would be nice if I could just use it for all the features. So hopefully that's something that Sony does in the future. Next, I want to talk about the communication options. The RX10 Mark IV has built-in Wi-Fi with NFC or near field communication. And that lets you pair it up with a mobile device and then transfer images and videos and even control the camera using an app. So transferring files is pretty easy. You can just go to the menu and hit send to smartphone, then connect to the phone and the images or videos will be transferred. For remote control, the Play Memories app does give you control over most of the features that you're gonna need. So for video, you could set exposure mode, change shutter speed, ISO, you can do exposure compensation, white balance, and then start and stop your video. Now for images, for some reason, I could do all the same things except for change the exposure mode, which was strange. Now, one of the issues that I did run into is that for both photography and video, you can't set focus or see where the focus point is. So basically, you're looking at the screen and it's up to you to tell what's in focus, but you can't tell where the focus point is, so you can't even reframe to put the focus point over your subject. That made it a little challenging. I also couldn't change aperture because the aperture is changed using the manual ring on the lens. And again, I don't know why it wouldn't let me change the aperture through the app, because there are some exposure modes where the camera can change the aperture for you, and it does that electronically regardless of where the ring is at. So I'm not sure why the app couldn't do it, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. And that's not a super big deal, but if you did this much work, just go ahead and finish the job so I can do everything through the app, and that would make it awesome. That's a lot more functionality than what we saw with the A6500 when operating remotely. And I hope that Sony at some point just incorporates the focus issue. That's really the biggest deal. Once they do that, this thing is gonna rock. Let's talk about the skill level that I think is required for using this camera. The RX10 Mark IV is really easy to use, and beginners should have no problems just picking it up, selecting one of the automated settings, and then immediately starting to shoot. And honestly, the first thing that stumped me is the aperture control, because I just wasn't expecting to have to do it from the ring. Now, obviously, once you know that that's how you do it, it's not a big deal. But I was looking on the back here and I'm thinking, like, how come none of these change the aperture? But that's just me, and again, it's super easy, it's just a ring on the lens. Now, more advanced users are still gonna love the level of control that this camera offers, and that's for both photography and video. You really have so much that you can do. There are picture styles and different profiles that you can set, tons of exposure modes. There is so much that you can do with this. Like, I seriously doubt that from that standpoint, you're gonna find that you're limited by this camera. And the focal length range is obviously outstanding, so there's a lot of flexibility there. And it's a great camera to take with you when you're traveling or when you just want to go out and shoot. Like, you don't need a bulky bag, you don't need any additional lenses. You just throw this in a small bag or just put it over your shoulder with a nice camera strap and then off you go. All right, so the RX10 Mark IV is an awesome all-in-one camera for someone who just wants to own one camera and lens combo and then use it for everything. We got the 20.1 megapixel 1-inch sensor and a new processor, so you get excellent image quality and good low light performance. You can shoot 4K video at up to 30 frames per second and then full HD or 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. And then don't forget the high frame rate function, which is even more impressive for slow motion. We've got an excellent 24 to 600 millimeter equivalent Zeiss lens. It's got the ability to shoot continuously at 24 frames per second. The 315 phase detection autofocus points work great with continuous autofocus for both photography and for video. There's a mic input which lets you connect an external microphone and get great audio without having to record it separately and then sync it in post-production. And then even a headphone jack, which lets you monitor audio while recording. The touchscreen is a little limited, but it's great for autofocus and for displaying the current selected attributes and settings. Just remember that you can't use it to control the camera or navigate the menus. The built-in Wi-Fi lets you move images and videos from the camera to a mobile device, and you have a pretty good level of control of the camera using the Play Memories camera app. Right now, the RX10 Mark IV sells for $698, and I'll put links in the description both to this camera and then all the accessories or anything else that I talked about in this video. And those links will always be updated with the most current prices. So whenever there are discounts or specials, you'll always get the lowest prices. I really hope this video gave you a good overview of the Sony RX10 Mark IV. If it did, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and then hit the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. Good luck and see you soon.